Good afternoon, everybody. It's 1:38 in the afternoon on Saturday. This is part two of the show I did this morning on Facebook where we had sound issues. Hopefully that sound issue is taken care of now. But I felt it that important that I need to redo this because the information I had, you couldn't hear what I was saying. So I feel this is extremely important information. And as I've said in every beginning of every show I've ever done, if you hear something here, it's Len's opinion on this case. It's my opinion on the interpretation of the information and data I have here in front of me. I feel it's that important that I want to share it with you. The title I put to this show today is SARS coronavirus a designer virus? You know what that means? It means, was it man-made? And I will tell you that as I've been watching this for the last, let's say, almost a year, I've seen the ups, the downs, and the sideways of the research that's been done on coronavirus. And I've come to the conclusion after reading what I'm going to read to you today, an article that came out of the Boston University School of Medicine just 2 days ago. I'm going to talk to you today about that because the takeaway message, if you interpret it the same way I do, is that there is no way that this virus in any way is similar to any flu that's ever come down the road. There's no way when you find out what this stuff actually does, what this virus actually does to the human body, that it could not be called something that was man-made. I'm also going to try to get involved in the huge number of tests that are now coming back positive. They're called PCR tests, polymerase chain reaction tests. The results come back either immediately or within the next 2 to 3 days. It can be as quick as 24 hours. It's become the gold standard of testing for coronavirus. Yet as the research has come out that says, in most cases, we're not doing this right. And in most cases, this PCR test is giving us about 50 to 51% false positives. So think about this. In an attempt by the people that are running this country now to keep us locked up, we need those numbers to go really high, don't we? So idiots like the governor of New York and California can continue the lockdown and close churches and close restaurants and ruin the economy to the nth degree. We need those numbers to look really bad, don't we? But if it really came out that 51% of the tests that are being done are false positives, that less than half of those people are actually positive, it would not match their goals. And likewise, if I read to you this new article that just came out today that basically says asymptomatic, these are people with no symptoms, those that test positive, but really don't have any symptoms. And I'm sure you know somebody that's in that category. They went out, maybe work demanded it, and they went out and had their test done. They came back, oh my God, I'm positive. And they get locked up for 10 days and had absolutely no symptoms at all. Well, guess what? The newest research says unless you have symptoms, you really don't spread it. Didn't hear that on the news, did you? So we're going to look at how SARS hijacks your body and your lungs. We're also going to look at nasal passages right up here. That's now coming into a focal point. And lastly, I'm going to go over an article that I've been carrying with me since August that came from England, that actually came from Italy, that was the rationale for using a specific prep to defend yourself and treat yourself from or with COVID-19. As I started the show this morning, I'm going to do this again because so often when we hear all this news and we're all contemplating another lockdown and we're all fighting and just dreading even watching the news, we become discouraged, don't we? So Chuck Swindoll, who I really appreciate, did a Insight for Living yesterday that he entitled Overcoming Discouragement. Being a prophet in Israel wasn't an easy gig. That's the understatement of the year. Most of the men God called were expected to boldly bear the bad news of God's displeasure with the attitude and the sins of his people. One such prophet often found himself in the pit of despair. Jeremiah chapter 20, verse 17 and 18 says, "Oh, that I had died in my mother's womb, that her body had been my grave. Why was I ever born? My entire life has been filled with trouble, sorrow, and shame." In my youngest daughter's home, they have a funny response when somebody in the family lets out such a pitiful, despairing trill. "You want some cheese with that wine? Or do I need to call the wambulance?" But Jeremiah's plight was no laughing matter. Israel had been on a long drift away from God. He had the dismaying task of pronouncing God's warning of sure judgment if they didn't repent and turn back to him in reverence. That ancient man of God, unfortunately, is not alone in feelings like that. Who hasn't struggled against the grain of God's mysterious, unknowable ways and found themselves discouraged and disillusioned? I certainly have on many occasions. But it's precisely in such times that we must remember God's promise to deliver and provide, to stand by our side and bring comfort to our troubled minds. That's his way. It always has been. The same weeping prophet, bent low in despair, wrote these triumphant words many years later. Jeremiah 29, "I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. They are plans for good and not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope." Bewildered by God's timing in your recent financial setback? They are plans for good and not for disaster. Are you anxious about the results of your biopsy? For I know the plans I have for you. Are you coming to terms with the finality of a loved one's death? I want to give you a future and a hope. Don't despair. God is still on his throne. Don't let your faith waver over his plan. It's for your good and for his glory. You can trust him. Good information. All right, let's go first to this. A vast majority of those testing positive for SARS coronavirus are asymptomatic, estimated about 70% of the patients. They are simply not sick. The PCR test, polymerase chain reaction, is merely picking up inactive or non-infectious viral particles. In one study, which looked at pregnant women admitted for delivery, 87.5% of the women who tested positive for the presence of SARS coronavirus had no symptoms, nearly 90%. A study looking at the PCR test data from nearly 10 million residents in Wuhan City, the starting point for this thing, found that not a single one of those that had been in close contact with an asymptomatic individual tested positive. 10 million people in Wuhan, not a single person who had been in close contact with anybody that was asymptomatic tested positive. Of the 34,424 residents with a history of COVID-19, 107 individuals tested positive a second time. 107 out of 35,000. But none were symptomatic and none were infectious. When asymptomatic patients were tested for antibodies, that's people that had no symptoms, they discovered that 190 of the 300, or 63.3%, had actually had a hot or productive infection resulting in the production of antibodies. Still, none of their contacts had been infected. According to media reports, COVID-19 cases, meaning positive PCR test results, are soaring across the United States and around the world, leading to the implementation of measures that in some cases are stricter than what we endured in the initial wave. However, As detailed in several recent articles, including one called Why COVID-19 Testing is a Tragic Waste, PCR tests are being used incorrectly, resulting in the false appearance of widespread transmission. In reality, the vast majority of people who end up with a positive test will not develop symptoms and aren't infectious. Needless to say, if you're not infectious, you pose no health risk to anyone, and being placed under what amounts to house arrest is nothing but cruel and unusual punishment for no reason whatsoever. Positive test rates have no bearing on mortality, says story number 2. In the Highwire report today, Dr. Bigtree reports and breaks down how excessively high test sensitivity leads to falsely elevated case numbers that in reality tell us nothing about the situation at hand. As noted by the doctor, what's missing from the COVID-19 conversion is the actual death rate. If COVID is a deadly virus, what should we see when cases increase, he asked. The answer, of course, is an increase in deaths. However, that's not happening, thank God. Aside from a small bump at the beginning, when doctors were unsure of the appropriate treatment, in some states recklessly and irresponsibly send infected patients to ill-equipped nursing homes, the death rate has remained relatively flat, while positive test rates have dramatically risen and fallen in intervals. One of the explanations for why positive test rates and mortality do not go hand in hand is simply the fact that a vast majority of those testing positive are asymptomatic. They simply aren't sick. The PCR test is merely picking up an inactive, non-infectious viral load. I want you to think about that. Story number 2, and this is dealing with sinuses. You know, they've said over and over again, one of the first signs of problems brewing is losing my sense of smell and taste. And now they're saying my sinus passages have become extremely dry. Would it not make sense? If that is increasing your risk factors of catching this thing, would it not make more sense to do that and keep your sinus passages moist using a saline nasal spray? Would that not make more sense? Because the amount of nasal protein receptors is linked with COVID-19 susceptibility. So if we know that there are numerous nasal protein receptors in the sinuses that become exposed, especially when they become extremely dry, would it not make more sense to keep the nasal passages moist? Saline nasal sprays, or we do make some nasal sprays in the office itself. So again, I'm going to read this article that just came out this week, and it says a protein called ACE2 is intimately involved in how Sars coronavirus causes COVID-19 to infect the body. The protein is found on nasal membrane cells, which is typically where the virus enters the body. So again, this was unknown not long ago because we knew those receptor sites were in the lungs. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how those receptor sites can become a problem. And I want you to listen to this. This is where I drew my conclusions. In a multi-group collaborative involving National Emerging Infectious Disease Laboratories, the Center for Regenerative Medicine, and the Center for Network Systems Biology, scientists have reported the first map of the molecular response of human lung cells to infection by coronavirus. By combining bioengineered human alveolar cells with sophisticated, highly precise mass spectroscopy technology, Boston University, one of the most traditional of universities, and the researchers have identified host proteins and pathways in lung cells whose levels change upon infection with SARS, providing insight into disease pathology and new therapeutic targets to block it. That's what we're going to talk about. How could you possibly block it? But I want you to listen to what they've now discovered happens. And I want you to think back when this thing first started. Here's a question for you. Did you hear the story about this thing coming from bats? Did you hear it coming from raw meat hanging in the markets in Wuhan, China? Did you ever think that they were really eating bats in China? Did you ever wonder if it really is true, how did it get from a bat to us? Did you think about that? And what made a bat a target? Well, we found out that bats, as far as mammals go, have the most intricate of immune systems. They're basically unable to really get ill. It's amazing. So where this virus could have started in a bat, it could have started in a bat. But I want you to listen, because it became resident in a bat. It got involved with tissue in a bat, and it morphed within a bat and managed to get out. They found a crucial type of protein modification called phosphorylation. Becomes aberrant, doesn't work. Phosphorylation is an extremely important part, as God made our bodies, that every cell in our body has this ability inside of the mitochondria, that's that energy part of every cell, to produce energy to sustain itself. God knew what he was doing when he built us. So when we look at this and say that phosphorylation means we take this PO3 group, which is a phosphorus group with 3 molecules of oxygen, and move it around in a chemical reaction in the mitochondria of our cells in an attempt for the body to take glucose and convert it to energy so it lives. But there's a protein modification when SARS got involved that blocked this PO3 from moving. Phosphorylation of proteins plays a major role in regulating protein function inside the cells of an organism. In both protein abundance and protein phosphorylation are typically highly controlled processes in the case of normal healthy cells. However, they discovered that SARS coronavirus throws the lung cells into disarray, causing abnormal changes in the protein amounts and the frequency of protein phosphorylation inside these cells. These abnormal changes help the virus to multiply and eventually destroy the cell. Destruction of infected cells may result in widespread lung injury. According to the researchers, listen, please, as soon as the SARS coronavirus enters lung cells, it rapidly begins to exploit the cell's core resources, its glucose supply, which is otherwise required for the cell's normal growth and function, oxygen and glucose. The virus uses these resources to proliferate, to get bigger, to spread, while evading attack by the body's immune system. It became buried inside of our own tissue, these ACE receptors in the lungs. Our immune system couldn't find it. In this way, the new viruses formed, which subsequently exit the exhausted and brutally damaged lung cells, leaving them self-destructed. So they stayed there until they multiplied. By the time they left, the lung cells died. Body can't exchange oxygen. The patient starts to die. These new viruses then affect other cells, such as the kidneys or the heart, where the same cycle is repeated. Explains corresponding author Andrew Emili, PhD, professor of biochemistry at Boston. Did you hear this anywhere in the news? Or were you of the same opinion as most people that this was just a virus that just got into our bloodstream and just lingered like the flu? It's not even similar. The researchers examined lung alveolar cells from 1 to 24 hours after infection to understand what changes occur in lung cells immediately at 1, 3, and 6 hours after infection, and what changes occurred later, 24 hours after. These changes were then compared to uninfected cells. All proteins from infected and uninfected alveolar cells corresponding to different time points were extracted and labeled, these tags. Our results showed that in comparison to normal unaffected cells, SARS-infected lung cells showed dramatic changes in the abundance of thousands of proteins and of phosphorylation events, said Daryl Houghton, professor of pathology. Moreover, our data showed that SARS coronavirus induced a significant number of these changes as early as 1 hour after infection and laid the foundation for a complete hijack of our lung cells. Now, if you look, trust me on this one, I am not one to get into conspiracy theories. But if we talk about what else in the history of mankind could do that, do what I just described, interfere with phosphorylation, cause lung cells to die. Search it yourself. And you'll find links to bioterrorism. You'll find links to things like sarin gas. And some of the things that happened in Syria, a couple of years ago, before Trump bombed the hell out of them. And the people died. They suffocated. I find it extremely hard to believe that in the history of mankind, no matter what genetic changes you think are possible out there, that this thing just all of a sudden showed up. And now that we understand what it does, is what's making it very difficult to fight. Which is why the concept of this vaccine, which is called an N-spike vaccine, is different than anything that's ever been created before. That's why they didn't have to wait years to come up with it. Is it going to work? I don't know. I think we give it to every Democrat that's out there and find out how they respond to it, and then we can make a decision. Just joking. But again, I can only come up with one conclusion. That's me. As a researcher, as a medical professional, is that this is a designer virus. If you want to change my mind, send me some data. Send it to info at thenutritionshop.net. I'd love to see it. Because I'm saying, based on this new information that just came out on yesterday, that this is scary. Now, how do you protect yourself? And again, at the end of the show that I did this morning, and I'm going to go through this quickly, the rationale for using N-acetylcysteine, NAC, which I feel is one of the most important entities that can be used right now to protect the lung cells. COVID-19 may cause pneumonia, acute respiratory distress syndrome, cardiovascular alterations, and multiple organ failure, which have been ascribed to a cytokine storm, a systemic inflammatory response, and an attack by the immune system. Moreover, an oxidative stress imbalance has been demonstrated to occur in COVID-19 patients. That's what I just described in the lungs. N-acetylcysteine is a precursor of reduced glutathione. Due to its tolerability, this pleiotropic drug has been proposed not only as a mucolytic agent, which means it breaks down mucus in the lungs, but also as a preventative therapeutic agent in a variety of disorders, including glutathione depletion and oxidative stress. At very high doses, NAC is also used as an antidote against paracetamol intoxication. That's Tylenol overdose. Helps to get it out. Thiols block angiotensin converting enzyme, thereby hampering penetration of Sars coronavirus into the cells. Since they get in through these ACE2 portals in the lungs and in the sinus passages, this interferes with that and doesn't allow it to happen. Based on the broad range of antioxidant and anti-inflammatory mechanisms, the oral administration of NAC is likely to attenuate the risk of developing COVID-19. Silvio De Flora, Sebastiano Lamastrea, published August 11th, 2020, in the FASEB Journal, Volume 34, Issue 10, if you think you want to doubt that I'm bringing up good information. Approximately 15% of coronavirus patients suffer from impairment of gas exchange and pneumonia. 5% undergo acute respiratory distress syndrome, septic shock, and multi-organ failure that requires hospitalization in intensive care units. Acute respiratory distress syndrome, the leading cause of death in COVID-19 patients, involves a cytokine storm and a systemic inflammatory response resulting from the release of large amounts of pro-inflammatory cytokines and chemokines that trigger an attack by the immune system. Besides affecting the respiratory symptom, COVID-19 affects other symptoms, including the cardiovascular symptom, and diffuse thrombosis is emerging as an important contributor to adverse outcomes in patients with COVID. So we do blood clots too. COVID-19 is particularly severe in individuals who are at risk either because of old age or pre-existing pathological conditions. For instance, in Italy, the mean age of patients dying of COVID in May was 80 years old, and 95.95% of deceased persons had important pre-existing conditions such as cardiovascular disease, cerebral vascular disease, diabetes, dementia, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, cancer, chronic liver disease, chronic renal disease, respiratory failure, HIV, autoimmune diseases, and or obesity. Again, one more time, the inhibition of thiols by SARS-2 coronavirus binding to cells. The angiotensin converting enzyme ACE2 is the functional receptor of the acute respiratory syndrome coronaviruses. And again, it says N-acetylcysteine, amazingly powerful in protection, and actually can be used in treatment. So the suggestion coming out of here was that individuals who were suffering from this in the hospital could receive intravenous doses of this and basically save their lives. Simple, inexpensive. Here's the summary of what I just shared with you. In my opinion, this is a designer virus. This didn't just happen. This was man-made, man-induced, and it's a pain. And if you're not taking N-acetylcysteine, i.e. like an SR form, sustained release form, 600 milligrams twice a day, you're missing the greatest way to defend yourself. I strongly believe if every person in the United States was taking that right now, including infants, we could put a stop to this thing overnight, rather than going through the expense of this vaccine without even knowing what the side effect profile is going to be. If you have questions on anything I just shared, whether you watched me on Facebook this morning and watched it bomb out on hopefully the voice is working on this. God bless you, folks. Give us a call at the office if you have questions, 678-228-8900, and I'll see you back here on Monday. Take care.